You ever sit down at a cash game and see a guy light his stack on fire before the cards are even dealt? That's what straddling often is. A bold move with no plan. And it's one of the most misunderstood and misused plays in the game. I'm Terry Wood from PokerRailbird.com, and today we're going to break it all down: the math, the strategy, the psychology, and the big difference between button straddles, under the gun straddles, and flat-out ego moves that cost players stacks. So let's ask the real question. Should you ever straddle in poker? Or is this just another one of those macho habits that makes you feel aggressive, but actually puts you at a huge disadvantage? Let's find out. Let's break down what a straddle actually is and what it does, not just in theory, but in real-world play. A straddle is a voluntary blind bet made before the cards are dealt, usually for double the big blind. In most rooms, it's only allowed from under the gun, meaning the first player to act pre-flop. That player puts in chips blind, then becomes the last to act pre-flop, since action wraps around. That might sound like an advantage, and pre-flop, it sort of is. You get to see what everyone else does before deciding. But that advantage lasts one betting round. Once the flop hits, you're now first to act if the big and small blinds fold, or at best in early position for the rest of the hand: flop, turn, and river. There's another version called the button straddle, which is allowed in some rooms. This lets the button post the straddle and act last pre-flop, while still maintaining positional advantage post-flop. That version can have merit. We'll look at it later. Back to the under the gun straddle, here's a key point. If the small and big blind fold to your straddle, you're now under the gun for the rest of the hand, first to act on every street. If either blind calls your straddle, you're still in an early, unfavorable position, likely third to act, with no informational edge. And this is where things often spiral. In many live games, about half the players who straddle will also raise their own straddle, often to a bloated size. They're not just straddling for fun, they're escalating the pot before cards are even in play. Why? Because straddling already inflates the pot. Now toss in a raise, sometimes 5 or 6 times the straddle, and suddenly the table has no room to breathe. Players who limped behind hoping to see a flop are now under pressure to call or fold to a huge raise. Here's what's critical to understand. If the straddler raises their own straddle, it's not because their hand magically improved. It's just as likely they don't want to play the hand against 5 limpers. They're out of position, and that raise is a way to reduce the field or take the pot down immediately. This is where pattern recognition becomes a real weapon. Track how often a player straddles and how often they raise it. Some will raise it every single time, no matter what. Others might only do it 20% of the time. And this matters. If they're raising their own straddle 100% of the time, or even 75%, you know that's not range-based. That's behavior. That's ego. That's image. But if they're raising 1 out of 5 times, now you have to be cautious. That's within the range of statistical possibility. Their hand could actually be strong, and your response needs to reflect that. This is how strong players separate themselves. They don't react emotionally. They collect data and adjust. Over time, they figure out which raises are real and which ones are just noise. So to recap, the under the gun straddle gives you last action pre-flop, but early position action post-flop, potentially even under the gun position, if the small and big blind fold. It inflates the pot before you've seen your cards. Many players who straddle will also raise, aggressively, to thin the field or create chaos. And if you're watching closely, you can separate the math from the madness. Next, we'll run the numbers, the EV behind straddling, and what the math says about long-term profitability. So let's get to the real question. Is straddling profitable over the long run? We've hinted at the answer, now it's time to prove it. Example 1, you straddle and don't raise. Let's say you are in a $1, $3 blind game and you straddle to $6 and 5 players call behind you. No one raises. You go to the flop. $6 from you, $30 from 5 callers. Total pot equals $36. Take out $6 for rake and now the pot is $30. If you win the hand, your net profit is $30 minus $6 equals $24. Your investment was $6, so your break-even win rate is $6 divided by $24 equals 25%. That means you need to win 25% of your straddled hands just to break even, and that's with 5 callers. What if there were 3 callers? Now your win rate to break even is 33%, and that's assuming no rake. If rake was applied to that pot, now your must-win rate is 50%. Ask yourself this, regardless of the straddle, do you win 25 to 50% of your big blind hands? Because when you straddle under the gun, you just turned yourself into the big blind and made it worse by voluntarily adding unnecessary chips to the pot without knowing your hand value. Important disclaimer, that 25% figure assumes no one raises, no further bets are made on any street. You go straight to showdown. I don't know about where you play, but where I play that almost never happens. You're going to face more bets on various streets, not to mention the likelihood of missing the flop and fold, hitting second best hands and call down, try to bluff and get lipped up, lose value to rake even when you win small pots. So in reality, your actual win rate is far lower, often under 15% in multi-way pots like this. Example 2, you straddle and raise. Now let's say you straddle to $6, then raise $24, making your straddle total bet of $30 after looking at your hand. You get 4 callers. You invest $30. 4 callers contribute $120. Total pot equals $150. Subtract $6 rake, making the net pot $144. Your net profit equals $144 minus $30 for a total of $114 net win rate. Break-even win rate. $30 divided by $114 equals 26.3%. You now have to win over 26% of these raised pots just to break even. And again, that assumes no further betting post-flop. No c-bets, no turn barrels, no river calls, just a showdown and a win. That's not how poker works, especially not from early position, with no control and no fold equity. Let's bring it to life. We have the Queen of Spades and the 9 of Diamonds. You straddle. 5 players call. You check with Queen 9 offsuit and head to the flop. Here are your odds for improving your hand from pre-flop to river. You will make one pair, either the Queen or the 9, about 50% of the time, or 1-to-1 odds. The probability of getting 2 pair by the river is 6.8% or 13.7-to-1 odds. Trips, well, that's 4.8% or 20-to-1 odds. How about to flop trips? That's 1% probability or 99-to-1 odds. Make a full house by the river, 0.9% or 110-to-1 odds. And of course, since you have 2 gap connectors, you have straight potential, right? Well, there's about a 6% probability or 15.7-to-1 odds of making that straight by the river. So half the time, you make just one pair, and if that's the Queen, well, now you have a terrible kicker to go with it. But worse, you hit the 9, now what? And when that flop comes, the Queen of Diamonds, the 7 of Spades, and the 2 of Spades, here's your reality. Ace Queen, King Queen, Queen Jack, and Queen 10 all have you beat. If you bet, you get called by better. If you check, someone bets behind and takes control. You're out of position, outkicked, and outmaneuvered. Even when you hit the Queen, you're most likely behind. Even when you connect, you can't control the pot. And when you miss, you're throwing away chips from early position. The math doesn't lie. Whether you straddle and check or straddle and raise, the numbers are against you. Straddle and check, you must win 25% just to break even. Straddle and raise, you must win 26% just to break even. And remember, we calculated these numbers based on no further action in the hand, which almost never happens. Actual win rates? Often 15% or less. You're not gaining edge, you're just increasing variance. You're not building profit, you're building pots for the house to rake and an opponent to win. And you're not in control, you're just first to act in bloated, multi-way hands with no plan. Next, we'll look at the rare exceptions, those specific conditions where straddling can be turned into a weapon instead of a leak. But you better know the table, know your timing, and know the math cold. When and why a straddle can work. Before we go any further, let's be clear about one thing. We are not advocating the under-the-gun straddle. In almost all cases, the under-the-gun straddle is a mathematical leak. It puts you out of position for the rest of the hand, bloats the pot before you know what you're up against, and turns every decision into a defensive move. You're upside down in the math before the flop even hits the board. If there's any version of the straddle that has strategic potential, it's the button straddle, where you keep post-flop position, gain pre-flop leverage, and can better manage the flow of the hand. And even then, it should be used wisely and sparingly, not as a routine. Let's take a look at 4 potential situations in which a button straddle may serve a strategic purpose. 1. The table is passive or weak tight. If you're at a table where players fold too much pre-flop, a button straddle can create pressure and pull dead money into the pot, giving you the chance to scoop it up with a well-timed raise. But be careful, if multiple players call your straddle, you're now playing a bloated pot against several opponents. Only raise your straddle when you have reasonable hand equity, and even then, use this tool strategically, not habitually. 2. You've built a respected, aggressive image. When you've been playing solid, tight aggressive poker and your table knows it, your straddle carries extra weight. Players may be hesitant to limp light or challenge your raise. That gives you the chance to apply pressure and even steal pots you have no business winning if you've earned that image. But this only works if you've shown discipline, you've managed your table presence, and you're not overusing the straddle to the point it becomes predictable. 3. You want to disrupt table rhythm. In some games, a well-timed button straddle can shake things up. If the table's gotten tight, robotic, or stale, a straddle changes the dynamic. It forces players to make quicker decisions, rethink their timing, and abandon the patterns they've settled into. But again, this only works if you know how to navigate the chaos you create. Otherwise, you're just throwing gasoline on a fire you can't control. 4. Short-handed or high-level environments. In short-handed games or high-skill games, where players are constantly adjusting ranges and exploiting one another, the button straddle can serve as a useful tool, shifting dynamics, masking hand strength, or adjusting tempo. But these situations are rare, and most 1-3 players aren't using the straddle this way. They're using it like a toy, not a weapon. When not to straddle. When you're under the gun, ever. When the table is loose passive and loves to call. When you're short-stacked. When you're doing it out of boredom. Or when you don't have a clear, strategic reason. Here's a strategy that I will never understand, and you'll see it frequently. Let's say you straddle. Then you raise your own straddle. The flop comes, and you check. Let's pause there. You just volunteered to put in extra money, declared strength with a raise, built a bloated pot, and now you're checking the flop? That's not strength. That's a billboard that says, I don't know what I'm doing. You've handed over pot control, surrendered the lead, and practically begged your opponents to bet into you. And again, I don't know where you play, but where I play, they will oblige you. Even a small continuation bet keeps your story consistent. It says, I still might have it. It creates hesitation. It protects your range. But checking after all that pre-flop noise? That's an open invitation to get steamrolled. So, if you're going to straddle and then raise, you better be prepared to follow through. Straddling is not a magic trick. It doesn't create value on its own. If anything, it magnifies the strengths and weaknesses already in your game. Used precisely, in the right spots, a button straddle can be part of a larger strategy. But for most players, the best advice is simple. Don't straddle. Most players don't straddle because it's smart. They straddle because they're bored, because they're stuck, because they want to gamble, because they saw someone else do it and thought, why not? They straddle because it feels like action, like they're taking control. But in poker, motion without direction is just drift, and the straddle is where a lot of players start drifting away from solid play. Let's be clear. You have to win 25% of straddled pots just to break even, and that assumes no further betting. You have to win over 26% of raised straddles, again, assuming a clean showdown with no more betting. And if you check the flop after all that pre-flop noise, you're not controlling the pot, you're surrendering it. That's not edge. That's not strength. That's not strategy. That's just leaking chips in slow motion. Straddling doesn't make you tougher. It doesn't give you a psychological edge. It doesn't scare anyone who knows what they're doing. Straddling, especially under the gun, is a trap disguised as aggression. The only version of the straddle that has any strategic merit is the button straddle, and even then only. In specific games, against specific players, with specific intentions. And when you have the discipline to follow through. If you don't know why you're straddling, don't. If you're under the gun, don't straddle. If you raise your straddle, you better be ready to follow through. And if you're just trying to make something happen, you're probably making it worse. At Poker Railbird, we believe in tools, not tricks. Straddling looks like strength, but most of the time, it's just ego in disguise. This is Terry Wood from PokerRailbird.com. If you think our content is of value, please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, we'll see you at the tables.